I reached across the dark VIP hospital bed, my fingers gently brushing the chest of my comatose patient, Cho Changmin. But before I could even check his IV, a massive, tattooed hand shot out of the dark, wrapping around my waist and pulling me directly onto his lap. He wasn't in a coma, he was wide awake. His dark eyes burned with a possessive, lethal obsession as he pressed my back against his chest and whispered, "You're not clocking out tonight, Ciara." I thought I was just treating a wealthy CEO. I didn't know I had just become the obsession of Seoul's most ruthless underground king. We are building a community of dark romance addicts here, so if you crave intense, forbidden K-drama romances with deeply possessive men who would burn the world for the women they claim, hit that subscribe button right now. Let's dive into the story. The steady, rhythmic chirp of the heart monitor was the only sound in the dimly lit VIP suite. I leaned across the starched hospital sheets, reaching for the IV drip positioned just above my comatose patient. My fingertips accidentally brushed the bare, warm skin of Cho Changmin's chest. For 30 days, the young, devastatingly handsome heir to the Cho empire had been trapped in a deep sleep, completely dependent on my care. Or so I thought. Before I could even pull my hand away, a massive, heavily tattooed grip clamped around my wrist. My breath vanished. The force was sudden and terrifyingly fluid. In a fraction of a second, I was yanked forward, tumbling onto the bed. My knees buckled and I landed flush against his hard, muscular chest, entirely trapped on his lap. A calloused hand immediately clamped over my mouth, stifling my scream. "Make a sound and we both die," he whispered. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sent a dangerous shiver straight down my spine. The man who was supposed to be in a medically induced coma was staring at me. His dark, calculating eyes burned with a lethal, possessive focus. He wasn't weak. He was a starving predator who had just caught his prey, his fingers pressing firmly into my waist to anchor me against him. "You're awake," I mumbled against his palm, my medical training desperately fighting against pure, blinding panic. "Your heart rate." "My heart is fine, Ciara," Changmin interrupted, his thumb lightly grazing my jawline. The heat radiating off his lean, inked torso was searing. "But yours is going to stop if you don't do exactly what I say." Suddenly, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. The heavy mahogany door of the VIP suite didn't swing open. It eased ajar with a chilling, deliberate silence. The shadow of a man's boots appeared in the sliver of light from the hallway. They weren't wearing hospital scrubs. Changmin's lethal gaze snapped from my face to the doorway. The threat level flipped instantly. He wasn't a patient anymore. He was a survivor. Moving with a terrifying, silent grace that defied his supposed atrophy, he released my mouth and reached beneath his mattress. His hand emerged, gripping a heavy, suppressed pistol. "They aren't here for my chart," he breathed, wrapping his thick arm around my waist and hauling me down horizontally onto the mattress. He threw the heavy blanket over us, plunging us into total darkness. My spine was pressed flush against the solid wall of his chest, his rapid heartbeat echoing violently against my own. The cold steel of his weapon rested inches from my face as the heavy door clicked fully open. "Hold your breath, nurse," he commanded softly. A muffled cough echoed in the dark as Changmin fired straight through the thick hospital blanket. The heavy body of the intruder hit the floor with a dull thud. Before my brain could even process the violent reality of what just happened, Changmin threw the heavy covers off. He grabbed my arm, pulling me off the mattress and toward the emergency exit. He took exactly 3 steps before his knees buckled. The paralytic he had been fed for an entire month was still actively fighting his nervous system. My trauma training instantly overrode my blinding terror. I darted forward, slipping my shoulder directly under his heavy, tattooed arm to brace his massive frame. He let out a harsh breath, leaning his weight against my side. The searing warmth of his bare skin burned right through the thin fabric of my navy blue scrubs as we rushed into the sterile, dimly lit stairwell. "You're dragging," he rasped, his hot breath ghosting dangerously close to my ear. "I'm the only reason you aren't tumbling down concrete." I shot back, gripping his solid, muscular waist tighter just to keep him upright. The friction of his chest pressing against my shoulder sent a completely inappropriate rush of electricity straight to my core. We burst through the heavy fire doors into the subterranean parking garage. A heavily armored SUV sat idling in the shadows, its driver already jumping out to pull the back door open. Changmin shoved me inside first, climbing in right behind me before the door sealed shut with a pressurized hiss. The cabin was instantly suffocated by the scent of rich leather, adrenaline, and his deeply intoxicating cologne. I scrambled backward against the plush seat, my chest heaving as I finally put a few inches of space between us. I stared at the lethal, breathless man sitting beside me. "Drop me off at the nearest precinct," I demanded, desperately trying to steady my shaking hands. "I need to call my sister and pack my things. Those men just saw my face." Changmin didn't tell his driver to move. He just stared at me, his dark eyes slowly tracking the frantic pulse beating at the base of my throat. Moving with that terrifying, lethal fluidity, he leaned forward, effectively trapping me against the tinted glass of the window. His calloused fingers reached out, gently brushing a stray braid away from my cheek. "No one is calling the authorities," he murmured, his deep voice carrying a chilling, absolute authority. "And you are definitely not going home." "You can't keep me in this car!" I yelled, my hand blindly reaching behind me for the door handle. A sharp electronic click echoed through the cabin as the child locks engaged. Changmin reached into the storage compartment, pulling out a sleek, encrypted phone. He tapped the glowing screen once, his intense, possessive gaze never leaving mine. "You don't have an apartment anymore, Ciara." The armored vehicle slowed to a halt, the massive steel gates of a sprawling coastal fortress sealing shut behind us. The sheer scale of the cliffside estate was staggering, a marvel of modern glass and dark stone, but my fury completely eclipsed the view. As Changmin guided me into a cavernous foyer, I finally ripped my arm away from his grip. "You can't just hijack my life!" I snapped, my voice echoing sharply off the polished marble floors. "My sister is going to call the authorities. My hospital is going to file a missing person report." He didn't blink. Moving with an infuriating, lethal calm, he picked up a sleek silver tablet from a nearby console and handed it to me. "No one is looking for you, Ciara." I stared at the glowing screen. It was a flawless, legally binding contract for a highly confidential private nursing position in Singapore. Below it was a bank statement. Every single cent of my family's crushing medical debt had been wiped out by a massive, untraceable wire transfer. Next to it was a sweet text message sent from my own number to my sister, promising to call her when I landed overseas. I felt the color drain from my face. "You bought me," I whispered, dropping the tablet onto the table like it burned my fingers. "I didn't buy you, I secured you," he corrected smoothly. He stepped into my personal space, completely erasing the distance between us until his intoxicating scent of cedar and danger clouded my senses. He reached out, taking my trembling hand, and pressed a heavy, silver keycard directly into my palm. His long fingers curled mine around the metal. "This opens every door in this estate," he murmured, his deep voice carrying a terrifying devotion. "You are not my prisoner, but out there, the men who saw your face tonight will hunt you down. And here, you are entirely untouchable." He left me alone in a breathtaking master suite, expecting me to simply accept my new gilded cage. I refused. I wasn't going to let a criminal orchestrate my entire existence, no matter how much his touch made my heart race. By 2 a.m, the estate was dead silent. I clutched the silver keycard, slipping out of my room and creeping down the sprawling, shadowed corridor. I just needed to find a landline. I just needed to hear my sister's voice. I made it exactly 20 steps before the air around me completely shifted. A massive, warm hand clamped gently around my wrist. I gasped, spinning around. Changmin stood towering over me in the dark hallway. He wasn't wearing a shirt, his defined, muscular chest rising and falling in a slow, calculated rhythm. He hadn't been asleep at all. He pulled me forward, pressing my spine flush against his bare, searing warmth. "Sleepwalking is dangerous in my house, Ciara," he whispered. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the adrenaline finally wore off, leaving a stark reality in its wake. During our frantic escape from the hospital, Changmin had violently ripped the IV line from his arm and the jagged tear had reopened. I stood in the center of his sprawling, dark marble bathroom, clutching a damp towel and a fresh medical kit. He was sitting on the edge of the massive soaking tub, completely shirtless. The warm light caught the sharp, defined lines of his torso, illuminating the intricate, dark syndicate tattoos spreading across his chest and down his forearms. "This is going to sting," I murmured, my voice betraying a slight tremble as I stepped between his parted knees. He didn't flinch as I pressed the antiseptic-soaked gauze to the bleeding cut just below his collarbone. The heat radiating from his bare skin was overwhelming. My fingers carefully navigated the raised ink of a coiling dragon, but my focus kept slipping. He wasn't looking at the wound. His intense, calculating eyes were fixed entirely on my face, tracking my every breath. "You were gentle like this in the ward," he rasped quietly, the deep vibration of his voice sending a sudden rush of heat straight to my core. My hands froze. "You were in a medically induced coma. You shouldn't remember anything." "I was paralyzed, Ciara, not deaf," he corrected, a faint, deeply possessive smirk touching the corners of his lips. "I heard the senior doctor call my ink the mark of a street thug. I also heard you tell him to get out of my room and show some respect." My breath caught. I had whispered those words weeks ago when I thought no one was listening, furiously defending a man I didn't even know. "I was trapped in the dark for an entire month," Changmin whispered, lifting his hand to gently cut my jaw. His thumb brushed slowly across my cheekbone, the touch agonizingly tender for a man with so much blood on his ledger. "Your voice was the only thing keeping me sane. I knew exactly who you were long before I opened my eyes." The realization washed over me, tearing down every single wall I had built. He hadn't just grabbed me during the ambush out of convenience. He had been waiting for me. I lowered the gauze, completely paralyzed by the raw, consuming devotion in his stare. The professional boundaries I had spent years maintaining were crumbling to ash under his fingertips. He slowly wrapped his calloused hand around my wrist, pulling me flush against his hard chest. His gaze dropped deliberately to my parted lips. "You have a terrible bedside manner," he murmured, his face tilting up, erasing the final fraction of space between us. I closed my eyes, completely surrendering to the pull. But before his mouth could claim mine, a shrill, deafening proximity alarm ruptured the quiet estate. I woke up to the rich smell of sizzling garlic and toasted sesame oil. The blaring proximity alarm from yesterday had been a false flag, a perimeter glitch that had shattered our breathless moment in the bathroom, leaving me a tangled mess of confusion and racing heartbeats. I padded barefoot down the sweeping, sunlit corridor of the coastal estate, tightening the belt of the dark, oversized silk robe I had found draped over the edge of my bed. I expected to find an army of heavily armed guards patrolling the halls. Instead, I found him. Changmin was standing in the center of a sprawling, dark marble kitchen. The ruthless syndicate boss was wearing a pair of faded gray sweatpants slung low on his hips, completely shirtless. The morning sunlight caught the sharp definition of his back and the coiling dragon scales inked across his skin as he effortlessly flipped something in a heavy cast iron skillet. He didn't even turn his head. "Sit down, Ciara." "You cook?" I asked, my voice slightly husky from sleep, hesitating near the arched doorway. He finally looked over his shoulder. The lethal, untouchable aura was entirely gone, replaced by a devastatingly soft, knowing smirk. "You skipped your lunch break exactly 19 times this month," he murmured, sliding a flawlessly plated breakfast onto the kitchen island. "You spend all your time taking care of everyone else. Someone needs to make sure you actually eat." I slid onto the high stool, my heart doing a treacherous, frantic flutter. He leaned his forearms against the cool marble directly across from me, the searing warmth of his bare chest just inches away. His dark, calculating eyes tracked my every movement with a starving, absolute focus. I picked up the silver fork and took a small bite. It was incredible. For a fleeting, beautiful second, the terrifying reality of his violent world completely vanished. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a man looking at me like I was his entire universe. I opened my mouth to tell him it was delicious, but the heavy kitchen doors suddenly burst open. Changmin's soft expression vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, freezing violence, as his top lieutenant marched into the room. The man didn't apologize for the intrusion. He simply slammed a thick, heavily blood-stained folder down onto the pristine marble right next to my plate. "Boss," the lieutenant breathed, his chest heaving with exertion. "The Iron Orchid, they found the perimeter." The blood-stained folder hitting the pristine marble shattered our quiet morning instantly. Changmin's soft, teasing smile vanished, replaced by a freezing, calculated mask. He didn't even glance at the lieutenant. His dark eyes flicked to the files, his jaw tightening into a sharp, rigid line. The Iron Orchid Syndicate hadn't just found the perimeter, they had bypassed the outer sensors completely. "Get her away from the glass," Changmin commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that demanded immediate obedience. But before the lieutenant could even take a single step, the massive kitchen window exploded. A deafening crack split the air. Shards of thick glass rained down like jagged ice. I didn't even have time to scream. Changmin moved with blinding, seamless agility. He threw himself across the marble island, his heavy, muscular frame colliding directly with mine. We crashed to the floor, his broad chest completely blanketing my body, shielding me from the deadly shower of debris. "Stay down," he growled, his arms caging me securely against the cold tiles. The searing warmth of his bare skin pressed flush against me. His heart thundered against my cheek, a frantic, violent rhythm that mirrored my own. Heavily armed guards flooded the kitchen, their shouts echoing through the sprawling estate as they secured the breached room. Changmin didn't flinch at the chaos. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze sweeping the ruined kitchen before locking onto his lieutenant. The realization was immediate and terrifying. "This fortress is a ghost location," Changmin whispered, his tone dropping to a lethal, chilling register. "They didn't find us, someone let them in." He stood up, effortlessly pulling me to my feet and tucking me securely against his side. His grip on my waist was an iron tether. He marched me out of the destroyed kitchen and into the grand hallway, where his men had already dragged a trembling guard to his knees. The traitor, the air in the corridor grew incredibly heavy. Changmin stepped forward, the raw, terrifying aura of a syndicate king rolling off him in waves. But before the violence could unfold, his large, calloused hand reached up, gently but firmly pressing my face into the crook of his neck, completely shielding my eyes from the brutal reality of his world. I buried my face in his warm skin, inhaling the scent of cedar and gunpowder, listening to the muffled, agonizing sound of a traitor meeting his end. When the heavy silence finally returned, Changmin's arms wrapped tightly around my trembling shoulders. "I can't wait for them to come to us anymore," he murmured into my braided hair, his jaw locked in pure, protective rage. "We are going on the offensive." The heavy steel door of the underground panic room sealed shut with a pressurized hiss, completely cutting off the chaotic shouts echoing through the estate above. The sterile, cool air of the bunker was a stark contrast to the violent adrenaline still burning through my veins. My hands were shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. A sniper's bullet had just missed me by a fraction of an inch. Changmin didn't sit down. He paced the narrow length of the safe room like a caged apex predator, his broad, bare chest heaving. The dark dragon scales inked across his skin seemed to flex with every tense, calculated breath. He ran a calloused hand through his dark hair, his intense eyes finally locking onto me where I stood frozen against the wall. In 3 long strides, he completely erased the distance between us. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply reached out, his large hands frantically mapping my shoulders, my arms, gently tracing the line of my neck to assure himself I was entirely unharmed. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration that echoed in the quiet bunker. "Someone just tried to put a bullet through my head." I breathed, my voice cracking slightly. "And you threw yourself over shattered glass to stop it." He stepped closer, crowding my space until I was completely enveloped in his intoxicating scent of cedar and pure danger. I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let a single threat touch you, Ciara. The absolute terrifying devotion in his vow stripped away the very last shred of my professional boundaries. He wasn't my patient anymore. He wasn't just a syndicate boss keeping me under lock and key. He was a man who had bled for me, a man who looked at me like I was the only breathing thing in his dark world. I looked up into his deep, smoldering eyes, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't want to run away. I didn't want to hide behind my medical degree or the safety of my old life. I reached up, my trembling fingers gently tracing the sharp, flawless line of his jaw. Changmin let out a deep, ragged exhale. The lethal king vanished, leaving only a man utterly consumed by his obsession. He didn't wait for permission. His large hand slid to the back of my neck, his long fingers tangling fiercely into my braids as he tilted my head up. His mouth crashed down on mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, breathless, and entirely uncompromising. My hands instinctively grabbed his bare, muscular shoulders, anchoring myself to his searing warmth. He groaned, a deep, highly possessive sound, wrapping his thick arm around my waist to pull me flush against his hard torso. As the sterile walls of the panic room faded away, leaving only the scorching fire between us, I knew my shift was permanently over. I was entirely his. The sterile walls of the panic room were a stark contrast to the absolute fire that had consumed us the night before. I woke up in the master suite, tangled in soft, dark sheets, my mind reeling. I was an ER nurse. I saved lives. I wasn't supposed to fall for a man who took them. Yet every time I closed my eyes, all I could feel was the desperate, breathless pressure of Changmin's mouth on mine, and the heavy weight of his hands anchoring me to his dangerous world. I pushed myself out of bed, expecting to find my wrinkled navy blue scrubs folded on the chair. Instead, a sprawling array of tailored, deep emerald silk lay across the velvet chaise lounge. A small, handwritten note rested on top of the delicate fabric. "Your shift is over. Put this on." The silk draped perfectly over my curves, a liquid armor that made me feel less like a captive and more like a queen. When I finally stepped out of the bedroom, Changmin was waiting at the end of the grand sunlit corridor. He had traded his tactical gear for a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that emphasized the broad, imposing line of his shoulders. The top two buttons of his crisp shirt were left undone, flashing a teasing glimpse of the dark dragon ink underneath. He looked completely untouchable, but the moment his gaze landed on me, the lethal syndicate boss melted away. He crossed the distance between us, his dark eyes tracing the emerald silk with sheer, undeniable reverence. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet hall. He reached out, his calloused knuckles lightly brushing my cheek. The contrast of his rough hands against the delicate fabric sent a sudden, electric shiver straight down my spine. "We can't stay here today," he stated softly, his thumb resting gently on my lower lip. "The rival syndicate is actively probing the perimeter. We need to leave the estate, make some noise, and completely throw their trackers off our scent." My pulse spiked. Leaving the heavily fortified walls of the fortress felt terrifying, but the absolute certainty in his stare anchored me. He slipped his large hand down to interlock his fingers securely with mine, leading me toward the subterranean garage where a heavily armored vehicle sat idling in the shadows. He opened the heavy passenger door, but before I could step inside, he leaned in close, his warm lips brushing the sensitive skin just below my ear. "We are going to an exclusive luxury mall," he whispered, a dark, highly calculated edge suddenly lacing his tone. "You need new clothes, Ciara." As the heavy car door sealed shut behind me, a chilling realization settled deep in my chest. We weren't just running from the cartel to hide. He was putting us out in the open on purpose. We were the bait. The sprawling luxury mall was entirely empty, a cavernous monument to Changmin's staggering wealth and power. Every high-end boutique was open and fully lit, but we were the only customers. I stood in front of a gilded mirror, wearing a breathtaking ruby-red evening gown that the terrified staff had rushed to bring me. Changmin stood right behind me. He wasn't looking at the dress. His dark eyes were fixed on the reflection of the massive glass atrium behind us, his entire body thrumming with a lethal, coiled tension. I knew we were bait. My heart hammered against my ribs, but his large, warm hands rested securely on my bare shoulders, anchoring me to the spot. "You look perfect," he murmured, his deep voice carrying a terrifying calm. He leaned down, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of my neck. "Don't turn around, Ciara. Just keep smiling at the mirror." I forced a shaky smile, my trembling fingers gripping the silk fabric. In the reflection, I saw him make a subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist. It was a signal. High above us, hidden in the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, his elite snipers were locking onto the Iron Orchid assassins who had silently slipped into the building. Changmin's hand slid from my shoulder, his long fingers wrapping firmly around my waist. He was preparing to pull me into the safety of a reinforced corridor the second the first shot echoed. He had calculated every single variable. But Bei Daejung hadn't brought guns to a shootout. A strange, high-pitched electronic whine pierced the quiet air of the boutique. Changmin froze. The flawless, calculated mask of the untouchable syndicate king completely shattered. "Get down!" he roared. He didn't just pull me, he violently tackled me to the marble floor, completely shielding my body with his massive, muscular frame just as the world erupted. A deafening, catastrophic explosion tore through the center of the mall. The shockwave lifted us off the ground for a terrifying fraction of a second. Thousands of pounds of vaulted glass shattered simultaneously, raining down like a deadly, glittering storm. The ground violently shook as C4 charges detonated in a rapid, deafening sequence, ripping the luxury boutiques to shreds and plunging the entire sprawling complex into suffocating, chaotic darkness. The ringing in my ears was absolute, drowning out the catastrophic groans of the collapsing mall. Thick, gray dust choked the air, turning the luxury boutiques into a sprawling graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass. I was lying on the cold marble, entirely caged beneath Changmin's massive frame. He had shielded me completely from the blast. He pushed himself up, coughing harshly as he gripped my shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a raw, grating rasp over the chaos. I shook my head, my trembling hands clutching the torn silk of my red evening gown. He didn't waste a single second. He hauled me to my feet, wrapping his thick arm tightly around my waist, turning his body into a living shield as we rushed through the smoke-filled corridors. Every shadow felt lethal. We bypassed the main exits, moving toward a service stairwell, but the rival syndicate was waiting. 3 men emerged from the dust, raising their weapons. Changmin didn't hesitate. He pushed me behind a shattered concrete pillar and lunged into the fray. He was a terrifying force of nature, moving with blinding, brutal efficiency. I watched, paralyzed, as he dismantled the threat with his bare hands and a discarded weapon. He was fighting like a man who had absolutely everything to lose, solely to keep me breathing. The last man dropped, but a sudden sharp crack echoed from the upper balcony. I saw the glint of a rifle aimed directly at my chest. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, Changmin threw himself in front of me. The bullet tore through the shoulder of his charcoal suit jacket with a sickening impact. He grunted, his broad shoulders jerking violently, but he didn't fall. He raised his own weapon, firing precisely into the upper shadows until the threat was permanently silenced. "Changmin!" I cried, grabbing his arm as dark crimson began to soak through his crisp dress shirt. "Keep moving, Ciara," he gritted out, his jaw locked in agonizing tension. His hand found mine, his grip an iron tether pulling me down the remaining stairs and into the hidden service garage. We threw ourselves into a secondary armored car he had stationed for emergencies. The engine roared to life as we tore out into the night, leaving the burning wreckage far behind. I kept my hands pressed firmly against his bleeding shoulder, my trauma training screaming at me to stop the hemorrhage, but the wound was deep. The neon city lights blurred past us as we reached the heavy steel gates of a hidden off-the-grid bunker. The car lurched to a halt in the dark, isolated garage. I turned to him, but his hand slipped from the leather steering wheel. His massive chest he heaved with a shallow, ragged breath, and his head slumped forward against the console. "Changmin." I whispered, my fingers frantically finding the pulse at his neck. It was fading. I dragged Changmin's heavy, unresponsive frame out of the armored car and pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner of the hidden bunker. The heavy titanium doors hissed open, revealing a brilliantly lit, fully sterile underground trauma bay. Adrenaline completely overrode my panic. I wasn't just a captive hiding in the dark anymore. I was a trained emergency room nurse. Before I hauled his massive weight onto the central steel operating table, Changmin weakly unholstered his heavy steel handgun, dropping it with a loud clatter onto a nearby surgical tray. "Stay with me, Changmin," I commanded, my voice trembling but loud in the echoing room. I grabbed trauma shears from a pristine glass cabinet and cut away the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of his charcoal suit and dress shirt, exposing his broad, tattooed chest. The bullet was lodged deep in his shoulder, narrowly missing a major artery. I moved with frantic, calculated precision. I started an IV, flooded his system with fluids, and injected a local anesthetic directly into the wound site. My hands, which had flawlessly performed this exact procedure 100 times in the city hospital, suddenly began to shake. I wasn't afraid of the injury, and I wasn't lacking the right equipment. I was shaking because the terrifying Syndicate King lying under my hands was the center of my entire universe, and I was desperately terrified of losing him. I took a deep breath, forcing my professional composure into place. Grabbing the surgical forceps, I carefully navigated the torn tissue and coiling dragon ink. The metallic clink of the extracted bullet dropping into a stainless steel tray echoed loudly in the quiet bunker. I quickly packed the wound, applied pressure, and placed a series of flawless, even stitches across his skin. By the time I secured the final bandage, my ruby-red evening gown was ruined, and my chest was heaving with exhaustion. I stripped off my gloves and collapsed into a rolling stool beside the operating table. The steady, rhythmic beep of his heart monitor filled the sterile room, a beautiful, grounding sound that finally allowed the tears to spill over my eyelashes. I reached out, gently intertwining my fingers with his cold, calloused hand. The steady beeping picked up its pace. Changmin's dark eyes slowly fluttered open against the harsh glare of the surgical lights. He blinked, his gaze instantly shifting until it found my tear-streaked face. The lethal edge of the cartel boss was completely gone, leaving a man looking at me with pure, unguarded adoration. He weakly squeezed my fingers, a faint, devastatingly soft smile touching the corners of his pale lips. "I always knew you had gentle hands," he whispered. I couldn't stop the tears from falling. Hearing his voice, rough and weak, completely broke whatever professional shield I had left. I leaned forward, resting my forehead gently against his uninjured shoulder, breathing in the scent of antiseptic and his familiar, grounding cedar cologne. "You terrified me," I whispered, my voice thick with exhaustion. His good arm shifted, wrapping securely around my waist. His warm palm settled firmly against my spine, pressing me closer to the solid wall of his chest. "I'm not going anywhere, Ciara," he murmured, his deep voice rumbling against my cheek. The bright surgical lights hummed quietly, casting a stark glow over his pale, heavily tattooed skin. I lifted my head to look at him, expecting to see the calculating, ruthless king who had just torn through a building for me. Instead, his dark eyes were completely unguarded, swimming with a raw, desperate vulnerability that made my heart ache. "When the infection spiked in the hospital," Changmin began, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles on my lower back, it felt like I was drowning in ice. The paralytic kept me trapped in my own body. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The silence was driving me insane. My breath hitched. I remembered that night clearly. The VIP ward had been completely empty, the monitors flashing a dangerous fever. He had looked so entirely isolated. "But then you touched me," he continued, his voice dropping to a raspy, reverent whisper. "You sat beside my bed, you held my hand, you talked to me about your sister, about the rain outside. You didn't just check my vitals, Ciara, you anchored me to the world when my own mind was tearing me apart." The sheer weight of his confession settled deeply into my bones. "I didn't fall for you when I woke up in that suite," he confessed, his gaze burning with an absolute, consuming devotion. "I fell for you in the dark. You became my lifeline before I ever even saw your face." He shifted on the steel operating table. A faint grimace tightened his jaw from the fresh stitches, but his grip on my waist only grew fiercely stronger. With a slow, deliberate pull, he guided me up onto the narrow mattress beside him. I went willingly, careful not to brush his injured shoulder, until the ruined silk of my red gown was tangled with his legs. I was practically lying on top of him, completely surrounded by his searing warmth. He cradled the back of my neck, his calloused fingers tangling gently in my braids as he tilted my face down toward his. The dangerous, possessive syndicate boss seamlessly blended with the man who worshipped me. "I was going to kidnap you the day I was discharged anyway," he whispered fiercely, right before his mouth crashed against mine. The breathless fire of his kiss was violently shattered by a sound that froze the blood in my veins. The thick titanium door of the medical bunker let out a harsh, metallic groan. A shrill warning siren pierced the sterile air, confirming my absolute worst fear. The external locks were being forcibly breached. Changmin tore his mouth from mine, a sharp hiss escaping his lips as he instinctively tried to sit up. The fresh stitches in his shoulder strained dangerously against his skin, a fresh line of crimson threatening to seep through the white bandages. Bei Daejung hadn't just tracked us through the city. His men were standing right outside our only exit. Terror flared in my chest, but it was instantly swallowed by a fierce, blinding surge of adrenaline. I wasn't just a frightened nurse hiding behind a billionaire anymore. I slid off the narrow medical bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. Without a single second of hesitation, I reached across the surgical tray and grabbed the heavy steel handgun Changmin had discarded earlier. "Ciara, put that down," Changmin rasped, his voice tight with agony as he forced his uninjured arm under his weight, struggling to rise against his own failing strength. "You bled for me today," I whispered fiercely, gripping the freezing metal with both trembling hands and aiming the barrel squarely at the buckling door. "I am not letting them touch you." A shower of blinding sparks rained across the room as the reinforced hinges finally gave way. The door crashed inward with a deafening boom, sending a thick cloud of gray dust rolling over the pristine tiles. Bei Daejung stepped through the smoke, his pristine tailored suit completely out of place in the war zone. A cruel, triumphant smile twisted his features as his heavily armed guards flooded the entrance. He looked at me, a desperate woman in a ruined red gown, holding a shaking weapon, and let out a cold, mocking laugh. But the sound died in his throat. The atmospheric pressure in the bunker suddenly plummeted, turning the air to absolute ice. A towering, terrifying shadow completely eclipsed the bright surgical lights. Changmin didn't just push himself off the bed. Defying every logical medical limitation, he moved with a lethal fluidity that made the armed men physically step backward in fear. Bleeding, shirtless, and radiating the sheer, suffocating aura of the devil himself, the Syndicate King stepped directly in front of me, completely shielding my body with his own. Bei Daejung raised his hand to signal his armed guards, his arrogant smirk radiating cruel confidence. He drastically underestimated the man he was hunting. Changmin didn't just defend our sanctuary, he eradicated the threat entirely. Ignoring the fresh blood seeping through his shoulder bandages, Changmin lunged forward with blinding, terrifying speed. He swept the first guard's legs out from under him, claiming the dropped weapon in a single, fluid motion. The sterile medical bay transformed into a deafening, chaotic war zone for exactly 30 seconds. I stayed frozen against the edge of the surgical table, the heavy steel gun still shaking in my grip, watching the man I loved turn into an absolute force of nature. Every calculated strike, every flawless movement he made was executed with one singular desperate purpose: to keep me breathing. Daejung's arrogant smirk dissolved into sheer panic. He scrambled backward toward the ruined titanium doors, desperate to escape the slaughter he had just walked into. He didn't make it. Changmin closed the distance before the rival boss could even cross the threshold. Refusing to strain his freshly stitched shoulder, he grabbed Daejung by his tailored dove-gray lapels with his uninjured arm. Using his sheer, terrifying momentum, he slammed the rival boss violently into the reinforced concrete wall, pinning him there effortlessly. You brought a war into my home, Changmin growled, his deep voice carrying a chilling, absolute finality that echoed over the ringing silence of the bunker. And you aimed a weapon at my queen. The threat was neutralized in the next heartbeat. The heavy gray smoke from the breached door slowly began to settle, leaving a thick, heavy silence in its wake. The remaining mercenaries had either fled or been completely dismantled. Changmin tossed the discarded weapon onto the floor. He stood in the center of the ruined medical bay, his broad chest heaving with exertion. Dark crimson stained the white bandages across his shoulder, and his calloused hands were completely coated in the violent reality of his underground empire. Slowly, he turned to face me. The terrifying, lethal syndicate king instantly faded. His dark eyes found mine, and the ferocity drained completely from his expression, leaving him entirely exposed. He didn't step toward me. He didn't reach out to pull me into his arms like he usually did. He simply stood there amidst the wreckage of his enemies, looking at his own hands and then back up at me. He was giving me a choice. The unspoken question hung heavily in the cool, sterile air between us. I had finally seen the absolute, unrestrained monster he was capable of being. Now, I had to decide if I was going to drop the heavy steel handgun I was still clutching and run back to the safety of my normal life, or if I was going to walk across the shattered glass and claim him forever. The sweeping city skyline glittered harmlessly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Changmin's high-rise penthouse. The absolute chaos of the underground bunker felt like a distant nightmare, but the heavy reality of what had happened still lingered in the quiet room. The war was officially over. The rival syndicate was dismantled, and his empire was finally secure. I had finally showered away the dust of the bunker, slipping into the deep emerald silk dress Changmin had bought for me before the ambush. Across the room, Changmin stood near the glass, staring out at the city he ruled. He had traded his ruined suit for a soft, dark gray shirt, the top buttons unfastened to accommodate the fresh bandages on his shoulder. "The threat is completely neutralized," he stated quietly, his deep voice carrying a solemn weight as he turned to face me. "Your family's accounts are fully funded. The debt is erased." I stood by the velvet sofa, listening as the man who had torn through a building to protect me carefully built an exit for me to leave him. "There is a private car waiting downstairs," he continued, his dark eyes tracing my features with a starving, desperate kind of grief. "You can walk through those doors right now, Ciara. You can go back to your normal life. You never have to see the violence I am capable of ever again." He dropped his gaze to the marble floor, giving me the space to run. My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs, but there was absolutely no fear left in my veins. I didn't step back. I walked slowly across the polished floor, the emerald silk of my dress brushing against his legs as I completely erased the distance between us. I reached up, pressing my palms flat against the hard, warm muscle of his chest, right over his racing heart. "I'm not running," I whispered, holding his shocked gaze. "I didn't stitch you back together just to let you go." A sharp, ragged breath tore from his throat. The terrifying syndicate king completely surrendered. His large, calloused hands wrapped fiercely around my waist, pulling me flush against his solid frame. He rested his forehead against mine, his entire body trembling with the profound weight of my choice. When he finally pulled back, that familiar, intensely possessive spark had returned to his gaze. He reached into his pocket and brought out a small, velvet box, flipping it open with his thumb. Nestled inside was a massive, flawless diamond that caught the city lights like a beacon. Before I could even gasp, he slid the heavy ring onto my finger, his thumb anchoring securely over the platinum band. He leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a breathless, absolute vow. "Your shift is permanently over, nurse. You're the boss's wife now."